When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, we don't have a new show for you this week. However, we have a great rebroadcast of episode 16, played in 2015, the first year of Archaeological Fantasies, all about Afrocentrism. Some of this has been coming up in the news lately and in several different ways, so we thought it'd be a good chance to reacquaint you with this older episode in case you hadn't heard it. Here goes.
Tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hi, and welcome to the Archaeological Podcast, episode 16. Today, we're discussing Afrocentrism. What it is exactly, why isms are bad in general, and what we should really be doing instead of reinventing history. Stick around and get ready to think critically.
Digging in a trench, monuments, going to the pub when the day is spent. Funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies podcast. I am your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader.
Hi, Sarah.
How are you?
Good.
Okay, so today we have a very weighty topic. We're going to be talking about Afrocentrism, which is a very hard word to say. And I personally think it's a very deep topic to get to, but I think it's a very important topic to get to because Afrocentrism is one of the many isms that plague pseudo-archaeology, personally. And it's just one of the ones to hit on. It, however, is a very popular one.
Yeah, and it's a challenging topic, too, because it's one of those deals where a lot of it is based on a kind of fake archaeology, but the intentions of the people who propound Afrocentrism are often quite laudable. So it's not like we're dealing with the ancient aliens crowd. These are folks who sincerely believe, and rightfully so, that history has too often been kind of miscast, but then the reaction, that what they come up with as an alternative is equally false.
Right. It's like you said, it's an attempt to unwhitewash history, especially ancient history.
Right. Yeah, you bet. I mean,
but it swings way too far in the opposite direction. It actually takes the elements of Eurocentrism and just flips them on their head completely. And I don't feel like it actually fixes any of the problems that it's trying to address.
No, it doesn't fix them, and it creates actually additional ones.
It does, but it is important to talk about because it does deal with race and it does deal with racial issues in history, prehistory, and archaeology.
Absolutely, right.
So can you give us a good or a workable definition of what Afrocentrism is in case some of our listeners are not aware?
Sure. That's hard because there actually are multiple Afrocentrisms. But fundamentally, I think what Afrocentrism is a reaction to, as you use the term, Eurocentrism. A Eurocentric view of history and prehistory is one that kind of puts Europe right in the center, that everything is looked at from a European perspective, one in which all of the great advances and achievements made in history and in antiquity somehow originated in Europe. So that Europe is the preeminent cultural hub of all of the world for all of antiquity, and so that the developments that we see in the ancient world can all be traced back to ancient Europeans. Afrocentrism starts off with the laudable goal of saying, hey, wait a minute, that's really not true. that another part of the world, another continent or other continents, had equally important roles in the development of the modern world, and that Africa is one of those places. Afrocentrism tends to essentially just repeat what the Eurocentrists say, but they replace Europe with Africa. So that the great achievements, the great developments that we see in antiquity can be traced not to Europe, but also not North America, South America, Australia, or Asia, but instead to Africa. And that what we should do is rewrite the history books, rewrite history, recast history departments and history programs in high school to tell people the truth that all of the great things that constitute the modern world had as their source, their origin, Africa.
Now, I also see Afrocentrism causing two more problems that you may or may not agree with me on. One of them is that it relies on diffusionism, which diffusionism is a theory in archaeology. I don't think it's a functional theory anymore, that there was one culture, one Uber culture, and it bequeathed its knowledge upon the rest of the globe by either being uber popular and everybody just started copying them, or by sending out emissaries to teach other groups of people culture. Now, diffusionism isn't completely off the books. It's just not on the level that a lot of pseudo-archaeologists like to use it at.
Yeah.
And I feel Afrocentrism is using it like that. And I also don't like it. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that when I was an undergraduate, which is now we're looking at the late 1960s, I took courses with a wonderful archaeologist. His name is Pedro Armias. And Dr. Armias was a Spaniard who had moved to Mexico during or right after the Spanish Civil War, and became one of the best known Mesoamericanists of the middle 20th century. And he dealt with this a lot. He talked about diffusionism a lot. And his rule was, and I love this rule, he says that for the most part, people develop things independently. But when an idea did move, when diffusion did happen, the culture that was the recipient of this new idea, the only reason that they would employ that new idea is if they were on the verge of inventing it anyway, which actually makes a bunch of sense. You could not arrive at a hunter-gatherer camp where there are 25 people living a nomadic existence and say, here is the blueprint for building a pyramid. We're giving these to you. Go ahead and do it. Well, they're not going to do that, because the blueprints for building a pyramid that's not nearly enough. It's necessary, but not nearly sufficient for a culture to borrow pyramid building. You need a whole host.
Well, they don't have the building blocks of technology and skill.
They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the roads. They don't have the population.
Right.
They don't have the social patterns in which people demand that other people do stuff. They don't have the technology. So So that's what diffusionism was big in the 19th century, with the notion that it all started in Egypt. It all started in Greece. It all started in Mesopotamia, and it had to have spread out from there. So Afrocentrism essentially suffers from the same mistake made by Eurocentrists, which is people all over the world are pretty dull and uninventive, and they needed a genius culture to teach them all of the great complex behaviors and technologies that are seen throughout the ancient world. Essentially, ancient aliens, the theory of the continent of Atlantis being the source of everything, those are just extreme versions of diffusionism. Where Ignatius Donnelly pointed to the middle of the Atlantic and said all the great ideas, they came from Atlantis. And Eric von Daniken points up to the sky and says, no, all the great ideas and achievements of the ancient world, it comes from the frog people of Alpha Centauri or something. Well, well, the diffusionists in the 19th century would point to Greece, or would point to Mesopotamia, or would point to Rome and say, it all started there. It all came from there and spread out across the face of the planet. Well, Afrocentrists are no different from that. They make that same fundamental error that people needed to be inspired by some outside force in order to develop civilization, to develop complexity, they just point to Africa. So they're just pointing in a different direction, but it's the same tired explanation for human antiquity.
Well, and it also leads me to my second point that I don't like. Afrocentrism tends to treat the continent of Africa as if it was at some point one cohesive group with no variation whatsoever within the land. And that is just completely wrong. Africa hosted and still does host several different cultures, many of which were complex societies, not just Egypt,
right.
Which Afrocentrism seems to focus on more often than not on Egypt. I know there's some that look elsewhere, but usually when you're talking about Afrocentrists or talking with Afrocentrists, they're saying that everything came out of Egypt.
Now, let's be fair about it too. That Afrocentrists make the very valid point that when a lot of other folks are talking about the cultural developments in ancient Africa, they ignore Egypt as if Egypt were not actually a part of that continent, as if Egypt was, well, that's the Middle East. Well, no, Egypt is in Africa.
Yes, but a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, like even modern day people do not realize that Egypt is part of Africa.
Right. So when they talk, so some people will talk about, well, in ancient Africa, that was always really primitive, right? And you go, where do you think Egypt is? And they go, oh yeah, because usually when people in the West tend to stereotype Africa from the perspective of Africa south of the Sahara, and to be perfectly honest, Black Africa is seen as sort of separate from Northern Africa. But if we're going to be fair, the continent of Africa was the home to one of the world's earliest, most complex civilizations, ancient Egypt. But you're absolutely right. South of the Sahara, there's Great Zimbabwe and Meroe and Kush and Gene. And so there are these other very complex societies with cities and amazing architecture that anyone would recognize just looking at the technological achievements of these cultures and the structures that they built and their metallurgy and their agriculture. Anyone recognizes, oh yeah, that's an ancient civilization, but those are less well known, and they certainly belie the stereotype of primitive tribal Southern Africans.
Right, and they get a real disservice, I feel, in the archaeological community and in the prehistory communities, because most people will never hear about these different cultures or the achievements of these cultures. I mean, or that they even had agriculture.
Right.
You know, like you're saying, a lot of people, when you say Africa, they think deep Africa, deep Black Africa, where they're all just half-dressed savages running around with pointy sticks, you know, and that's so not what was going on.
And you know, and I do imagine, and I'm sure this is true, that some of Afrocentrism is inspired by things that Europeans have said about Africa south of the Sahara. When Great Zimbabwe is this amazing civilization that dates to around 1,000 years ago, in what used to be called the nation of Rhodesia is called Zimbabwe today, in honor of this amazing archaeological culture, this site called Great Zimbabwe, which people south of the Sahara understood as a time and a place when a great civilization that had nothing to do with Egypt developed in Africa. But, you know, when Europeans first encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, it's kind of interesting here, Sarah. It's a lot like the reaction that Europeans had to the mounds they saw in the American Midwest. It was, well, the local people, they're primitive and tribal. They couldn't have done it. We have to come up with an explanation for somebody of who else could have built it. And just as in the American Midwest, there were notions that the mounds were built by the lost tribes of Israel or by wandering Phoenicians or hell by Egyptians. Great Zimbabwe was initially ascribed to King Solomon of the Bible. That, oh yeah, the Israelites, they must have come down to Africa and they built this enormous city. But they weren't Black Africans; they were people from the Middle East. And that was, I mean, you're looking at something that up until the 1960s was still sort of the gospel preached by the white apartheid government of Rhodesia. That no, the blacks, they're primitive and always have been, but this evidence, this archaeological evidence of great sophistication and complexity, well, no, that wasn't them, that was somebody else. And so it is entirely understandable that people would react rather strongly to that kind of racist libel and say,
Right.
you know what, hell with that. In fact, Africa was the center, and it's you Europeans who took from us. It's kind of interesting, too, that one of the Afrocentrism as kind of a separate approach is not quite 100 years old, but there are publications dating back to the 1950s in which the claim was made that all of European achievements and developments were in fact stolen from ancient Africans. In fact, I believe the book was called by George James was called The Stolen Legacy. And this guy, James, who was an early Afrocentrist, said that Aristotle actually went to Egypt, stole all the writings that he could find there, and brought them back to Greece. And so that even ancient Greece, all of that was a stolen legacy. It was all based on what he stole from the ancient Egyptian libraries in, I believe, Alexandria.
And this is where Afrocentrism starts to become a branch of pseudoscience or pseudoarchaeology, because it is making claims like that can be falsified by known sources and dates and artifacts. Right. And I mean, we know when the Library of Alexandria was founded, and we know Aristotle when he lived.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Aristotle died, I don't know, it's like 25 years before the library was even established. So it'd be really hard for him to, steal all of this knowledge, a quarter of a century after he died.
Right.
And plus, a lot of the stuff in the library in Alexandria, we know, was not written in a local language. It was written in Greek. So we do know that the stuff in the Alexandria library, actually its source was Greece. Now, the ancient Greeks were hugely fascinated by the ancient Egyptians, and they saw themselves, at least in a general sense, as carriers of the legacy of civilization that had been established by the ancient Egyptians. But so there is that connection. But to say that the Greeks, that all of the architecture and art developed by the Greeks was something they stole from Egypt it's just patently absurd. And, and the thing, I think one of the things that bothers me the most, and this is a theme that I think will come up again and again in this podcast, is that it's sort of ironic, isn't it, that people whose laudable goal, is to let everybody understand that, in fact, there is a great history, a great legacy of the native peoples of Africa, including the native peoples of South Africa. It's ironic that they end up making stuff up to support that thesis when real archaeology and real history does a great job of supporting that very thesis. So it's sad and ironic. You don't have to make stuff up. Just talk about ancient Egypt. Talk about the real accomplishments of places like Meroe and Axum and Kush and Great Zimbabwe. And that's enough to support your claim that Africa belongs with all of the other continents and all the other people as part of the human story of the development of complexity and civilization. They're no different. They're no worse. They're no better. They are exactly another version, another channel in the development of the modern world. Now, you don't need to make stuff up to support that.
It is understandable, like you said, it is understandable why Afrocentrism became a popular theory. It is unfortunate that in its goal of combating basically the racism that was going on in history, in the fields of history and archaeology and prehistory, that it basically just, like you said, did the exact same thing, only instead of saying Europeans did it, they just were like saying Africans did it, specifically one culture in Africa. And so they kind of blind spotted the other great cultures in Africa.
Right.
And I will try to link to as many of those as I can find in the show notes, because I think it is important for people to go and look at the information that is there. Because I know when I was going through school, now granted, my school was a Midwestern school. We dealt mostly, like our prehistory dealt mostly with American prehistory, which of course is all Native American. So never heard anything about these great cultures in Africa that were these great prehistoric cultures in Africa, except for Egypt, of course.
Right.
Because that was the big culture to study back when archaeology was becoming a field, when we were coming out of antiquity, antiquarians who would just basically go and do a snatch and grab. And we were graduating into people who were actually going and taking notes and measurements and data and record keeping and that kind of stuff. That was all coming out of Egypt for the most part. Some of it was coming out of Mesoamerica. But for the most part, you're seeing that develop around Egypt and Egyptology,
right.
Which is why you don't hear about anything else.
Right. And, look, it's true. When you consider everybody who's listening to this podcast, I am sure you've seen a television documentary about ancient Egypt. You know the riches of King Tut's tomb. You've seen stuff in museums.
Right.
Ancient Egyptian civilization was absolutely mind-blowing, amazing stuff that these folks accomplished. And so, yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy when you hear of ancient civilizations, Egypt is one of those iconic symbols that, of course, pops up in everybody's head. Yes, ancient Egypt. That, unfortunately, means that there's, I think people have these little compartmentalized brains, and so they hear archaeology, oh yeah, there's Egypt, and there's no room in that compartment for the fact that, well, wait a minute, Egypt may have been, was certainly very early and was certainly the most complex civilization to develop in much of the ancient world, but let's leave some room for all of these other developments in Africa south of the Sahara that were amazing and that weren't necessarily inspired by Egypt. The timing is wrong, the distances are too great, so that and that's what's cool about in archaeology, the analysis of the development of complexity. Right? How come in just a few thousand years we go from being hunter-gatherers to primitive agriculturalists? This is all over the globe, and within not all at the same time, but all over the globe at separate times. Complexity develops where social stratification and the 1%ers and the 99%ers. Well, that didn't exist before. And it didn't exist before that people could command the labors of other people or demand a part of their food surplus. It wasn't even a food surplus. So it's like, how did that, what's much more interesting than, well, it developed once and they forced it on everybody else. Far more interesting is the notion that, wow, there must be some rule, some law that governs the development of human societies, because we see the same thing happening, in a general sense, the same thing, all over the world independently. That's way more interesting than, well, it came from Atlantis, or it came from Africa, or it came from Greece, or it came from anywhere else. That's what's pretty cool. And that's what, I mean, and if we as archaeologists haven't done a good job of emphasizing that, that's our bad, but let's fix that.
I really don't feel like we have done a very good job of emphasizing that. I mean, when you think of the great cultures of the ancient world, the first thing everybody points to is Egypt, and the next thing everybody points to is Stonehenge.
Yes, there you go.
And it's like, okay, they built Stonehenge, that's awesome and all that, but that's pretty much it. So I wouldn't, in my mind, that doesn't qualify it as a great culture. And we're ignoring everything in Asia. We're ignoring everything that was going on in North America. And we're ignoring everything that was going on in, like you said, Southern Africa. Yeah. So we're ignoring the rest of the world for this tiny little sliver, in the Western hemisphere there.
Yeah, and the thing too that's kind of interesting and sad is that ultimately the Afrocentrists don't know very much about Mesopotamia, along with the fact that in archaeology today we are very skeptical of the idea that there was a single mother. We have, I think, disproven the notion that there was a single mother culture that spread throughout the world and caused developments everywhere. We now believe that for the most part, cultures developed independently. Yeah, they're sharing. There's some movement of stuff, absolutely. But that generally there are these independent channels of development, and that's pretty cool. So we reject that general notion that, well, it all came from anywhere, Africa, Europe, it doesn't make a difference. But beyond that, there's a simple fundamental temporal problem here. And that is a lot of the things that, when you look at the Afrocentrists, they say Africans developed agriculture first, they developed ceramics first, they developed large-scale monumental works first, they developed a written language first, and every one of those claims is fundamentally wrong. Now, I'm not saying that anybody else had to come to Africa to teach Africans any of those technologies, but the fact of the matter is agriculture in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, predates agriculture in Africa. Ceramics in Eastern Asia predate the development of ceramics in Eastern Asia, in Africa. The development of large-scale monumental architecture is actually older in the first city-states of Mesopotamia than it is in Africa. So but here's to be completely honest about this, as an archaeologist, merely because the stuff is older elsewhere, I don't think that means those people taught the Africans how to do it. But by the same token, merely because it's old, so you can't. I disagree with the fundamental argument that a temporal priority implies that the oldest culture taught everybody else how to do it. Ancient people were capable and brilliant, and they were amazing at developing adaptations to their own territories. And when those adaptations involved the domestication of plants and animals, and when those adaptations involve the concentration of surpluses, of the development of stratigraphic social stratigraphy, social groups, when the monuments were built, that these things happened more or less independently. The people were capable of those achievements just about everywhere.
Okay. We're going to take our first break of the episode, and when we come back, we're going to continue talking about the problems with Afrocentrism.
This network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our future online store, and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
Your cardiologist knows your heart, and your mom knows how to mend your heart. Your ophthalmologist helps you see, and your best friend makes you feel seen. A visit to your physical therapist can heal your shoulder, and a visit to your grandma can heal your soul. Your health is a journey you don't take alone. Just like the people around you, all of us at Kaiser Permanente work together to help care for all that is you. Learn more at kp.org. Kaiser Permanente, for all that is you.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Okay, welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies podcast. We are still talking about Afrocentrism, and I was wondering, Ken, if you could define coevolution as it pertains to civilizations.
Yeah, sure. Here's what
Or is that even the right term to use?
I would use parallel evolution, all right?
Okay.
Parallel evolution in biology is that, for example, bats have wings, birds have wings. they didn't inherit wings from the same ancestor, but they developed those wings as an adaptation to some of the same kinds of evolutionary pressures. So that, listen, two different animal species, completely very unrelated, developed a similar adaptation. Well, it's the same thing that, for example, in multiple parts of the world, again, the same argument. It goes back to diffusionism. That for a time there were, especially cultural geographers, who believed, wow, agriculture, that's a really tough thing for people to develop. Probably it could only have developed in one place at one time and then spread out from there. But what the archaeological record has clearly shown is that in multiple places, people in no way historically connected to one another, faced with the same challenges, feeding more mouths as the Pleistocene waned and conditions changed. Population is growing. How do we increase the carrying capacity? How do we make it easier to feed more mouths? Well, what we can do is we can tend to these wild crops. I mean, even hunter-gatherers know that plants come from seeds, and that historically the Kung people, the Kung San, the folks living in the Kalahari Desert, would broadcast seeds. They would collect seeds from the wild plants that they subsisted on, and they would intentionally throw the seeds into fertile ground, knowing that those would germinate, would sprout, would grow, and produce more food for them. So that was an and people all over the world probably figured out, all right, one way we can maybe artificially increase the carrying capacity of this area is by encouraging the growth of those plants that we subsist on. And that then they figured out, well, you know what? Within any field of these wild plants, there are some in which the seeds are bigger. We like that. There are some that produce more seeds. We like that. There are some in which the seeds stick on until we pull them off, as opposed to a wind comes by, it rains, an animal walks through, and the seeds scatter all over the place. And so they begin, not quite intentionally, artificially selecting. Nature selects by providing an environment in which certain individuals of a species will thrive. They pass those down to subsequent generations. But people create their own environment by planting seeds, by watering them, by protecting them from other animals and from insects, and by encouraging the growth. But if you cull a seed bed by picking out the seeds that are not growing very fast, that the seeds look small, you are in effect beginning the process of artificial selection, which results in domestication, so that, for example, in Mexico, in Panama, in Central America, these little tiny seeds and these little seed spikes at a plant called teosinte, by selecting the bigger ones that form larger seed spikes, more tightly connected seeds, after generations of that, you have little baby corn cobs. And then after generations of selecting only the biggest cobs, you have big corn cobs. The thing is that people all over the world figured out that they could play a role in the encouragement of both plants and animals.
And we know this. The reason why we know this is happening is because we can actually trace the plants back in their evolution that we encourage, because we can find the predecessor to the modern plant and the predecessor to that predecessor and the predecessor to that predecessor. Yeah. So we have the evidence that backs up this idea.
Right. And that kind of evidence we see everywhere. If you look in Central America, in Mesoamerica, those of you out there who are familiar with the work of Scotty McNeish in Tehuacan Valley know that they found corn cobs that are about a 50th the size of the corn cob, of the corn you will buy at your market this summer. But it's corn. It's an early form of corn, and you can lay out the developmental sequence of corn cobs through time. You know what? You can do that with rice. You can do it with wheat. You can do that with a host of other crops. And that's the other thing that's really interesting about this claim, for example. So we're getting back to, that's parallel development. That's parallel evolution. Everywhere in the world where people needed to expand the area that they had under cultivation once they developed agriculture, just about everywhere in the world where there was a permanent water course, people figured out, you know what? We can dig ditches from those water courses and bring the water to places that don't get enough water now, but we can irrigate those fields to make them as rich almost as the water right along that stream. And the deal is, again, we see all over the world, people figure that out on their own. We don't see, for example, people in South America suddenly, amazingly building canals that are miles long. It starts small and it develops over time. And that's the pattern we see everywhere.
Right. And in the places where we do see things that could be attributed to diffusionism, we can trace it. Like Ken was saying, it doesn't happen unless the culture itself is ready for it. But I know that here in the Americas, there have been several studies to trace the progress of foodstuffs like corn, potatoes. And you can see where these foods were originating. Again, multiple places of origin. However, you can trace the progress of that food crop across the plains and into the Midwest and wherever it finally terminates, from one coast to the next or halfway across the continent. You can follow that progress.
Yeah.
So those are the only times that diffusionism really works, but it also backs up the idea that if you had one great uber culture and it came out of Egypt, what was Egypt's main food staple?
Well, look at it. There was sorghum and millet.
Right. And you don't see that really outside of ancient Egypt. So that's telling you that if these people really were diffusing their knowledge of how to grow sorghum and millet, why did they get to China and suddenly switch to rice, or get to America and switch to maize, or get to Europe and decide that, hey, wheat, why not?
Yeah, that's one of the fundamental flaws in diffusionism altogether. You talk about, say, the lost continent of Atlantis, and here's Ignatius Donnelly saying agriculture developed on Atlantis and it spread out from there. But then the irony is, well, what were the Atlanteans doing? How come the Atlanteans gave rice to the Chinese and wheat to Southwest Asia, but corn to the Americas? Why did they not give the same? Why did they pick and choose which crops to give where? It's kind of a similar argument. Well, why did Egypt, where the primary crops early on, the earliest agriculture in Egypt, you're looking at sorghum and millet, but the earliest agriculture in Mesopotamia is wheat. And by the way, it's earlier in Mesopotamia than it is in Egypt. And the earliest agriculture and the earliest agricultural products in the New World in Mesoamerica, it's corn. Squash actually is a little bit older, and then corn, and later beans. And in South America, we've got potatoes. Well, again, it doesn't make any sense because none of those crops were developed in Egypt. So how did the Egyptians, whose ancestors developed sorghum and millet as agriculture, as domesticated products, or how did they end up giving potatoes to the South Americans? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't detract in any way from the magnificence of ancient African societies to simply say, yeah, but they weren't the source of these developments in the rest of the world.
Right. And you're also, I feel like it's also taking away attention and that should be focused on what those cultures achieved. And I'm not talking about, the North American cultures. I mean, the African cultures that did develop these complex societies and did develop agriculture and did develop their own forms of writing and did develop their own forms of pottery and all of that, instead of celebrating each culture for their achievements, I feel like Afrocentrism tries to lump them all together, kind of mixes them up in a big hodgepodge, and then tries to force feed those cultures into a diffusionist outlook, completely taking away from the cultures that they're trying to bring attention to.
Yeah. I mean, it is ironic that among the Afrocentrists who focus on ancient Egypt, they kind of treat as kind of second-class citizens the other civilizations of Africa.
Yeah.
Because, well, some of those folks developed at a time and place where clearly they had no inspiration from ancient Egypt. I mean, the Nubians in the region of the Upper Nile, that is way upstream, clearly they had contact with ancient Egypt, and the Nubians built the small pyramids, and we can see in the artwork of ancient Egypt that there were Africans from south of the Sahara who interacted with ancient Egyptians. But let's not make those second class or second category civilizations, because that would be supremely ironic, right? If somebody attempting to show the primacy of African culture sort of ignored the non-Egyptian component of those developments. And what's interesting, too, is that among some Afrocentrists as well, when you point out, but wait a minute, there's all this Black Africa, south of the Sahara, and that the Africa of Egypt, they were different. There's diversity in Africa. Some Afrocentrists will claim that the Egyptians themselves were, in fact, Black sub-Saharan Africans. And what's interesting about that is that, the Egyptians themselves depicted artistically themselves and the people with whom they interacted. And they made, in their artwork, it is very clear. Yeah, there are Black, very dark-skinned people in Egypt during pharaonic times. But that the Egyptian leadership, the rulers, the pharaohs, are almost always depicted as brown-skinned. They're not white folks, they're brown-skinned. But they do depict very, very dark, in fact, Black-skinned people trading with them, bringing animals that are Southern African to trade with emissaries of the pharaoh. So this is not, I don't think this is really, I don't think skin color is all that important, but it's very clear that Egypt was a diverse nation. There were very dark-skinned people, there were lighter-skinned people, but by and large, when the Egyptian upper elites had themselves depicted, they were depicted with brown skin, not with black skin. I don't think that's hugely important, but some Afrocentrists make it a point to claim that no, in fact, the pharaohs and all the big mucky mucks in ancient Egypt were in fact sub-Saharan Africans.
I agree with you that I don't think the end color is important in its own, but I think it is important that they were making an effort to depict different cultures. Because it is showing, like you said, it's a multicultural area, and they're showing that they are interacting with people who are not their people, because Egyptian people were being depicted as brown-skinned, and the other culture was being depicted as a people of a different color. It's a way of showing difference, so that you know which group belongs to who.
Absolutely.
And it's very important, because now we know that there was trade. We know who they were trading with. Of course, they kept records on everything, so we know where these people came from and what they were trading, blah, 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 blah.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also very easy to visually distinguish between the two groups, which was the importance of that. The color of the people that they ended up with, not necessarily as important, but I'm with you. That doesn't also then mean that they must have been Black Africans or Nubian peoples, and thereby, again, trying to clump everybody into the same pot when it's clear that that was not true.
And the Nubians had their own civilization. They had an extremely complex and sophisticated civilization that interacted with the kind of the stereotypical image we have of ancient Egyptian civilization. There was interaction there. And just as the Nubians were inspired in some way by ancient Egypt, the Egyptians were inspired by Nubians. And it's like the modern world in which two sophisticated cultures are in contact with one another, and each draws from the other ideas and inspirations for how to improve their own lot, their own technologies. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And again, the reason we know this is because we have archaeological records and archaeological data that backs this up. So again, it all comes back to the archaeology is providing evidence of this, whereas a lot of the claims that are being made by Afrocentrists and Afrocentrism do not hold up because there's no evidence. Same thing with Eurocentrism.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, most of the isms fall flat.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a really important point to make. I don't want to replace Afrocentrism with any other, centrism at all.
Right.
But
no, that's not what we're advocating.
I think ultimately the sad thing here is it's like we don't need Afrocentrism to re-examine the ancient world and recognize that Eurocentrism was wrong and has no scientific or evidentiary support.
Right.
That Eurocentrism falls apart on the data. And Afrocentrism doesn't have to replace Eurocentrism. All we need to do to elevate, to understand how complex and sophisticated the ancient societies of Africa were is by looking at the evidence of the ancient societies of Africa. And we don't need to make up stories. We don't need to reimagine the past. We have to simply look at what the archaeological and historical records show. And when we do that, again, we find that people all over the world developed amazing technologies, amazing levels of complexity, and were able to build monuments and to feed large numbers of people and to develop agriculture and to develop metallurgy and ceramic technology and math and calendars and science. And because we are all, after all, human beings, we are more alike than we are different, and we all have equal capacities for any of these developments, and they happen all over the world. And we know that archaeologically.
Okay, and we're going to take our last break of the episode, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up our discussion on Afrocentrism. So stick around.
Your cardiologist knows your heart, and your mom knows how to mend your heart. Your ophthalmologist helps you see, and your best friend makes you feel seen. A visit to your physical therapist can heal your shoulder, and a visit to your grandma can heal your soul. Your health is a journey you don't take alone. Just like the people around you, all of us at Kaiser Permanente work together to help care for all that is you. Learn more at kp.org. Kaiser Permanente, for all that is you.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Interested in archaeology? Want to hear from experts in the field about the latest discoveries and interpretations? Check out the Archaeology Show every other Saturday and let hosts Chris Webster and April Camp Whitaker take you deeper into the story. Check out the Archaeology Show at www.archpodnet.com/archaeology and subscribe, rate, and comment on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and the Google Music Store. That's www.archpodnet.com/archaeology. Now back to the show.
Right, and we are back, and let's wrap up our ideas on Afrocentrism and in general, isms, because I think we've kind of pointed out here that we're not just harping on Afrocentrism. It's just the one we chose to focus on. But all of the isms are not good because they're very short-sighted. They try too hard to cram everything into one definition, and they take away attention on other cultures that were equally as impressive, and some cultures that may not have been as complex, but that doesn't make them any less impressive as a culture.
Yeah, all these centrisms tend to try to elevate one particular group of people above everybody else. And, you know, it was wrong when it was Europeans doing it about Europe, and it's wrong when Afrocentrists do it about Africa. Just before we absolutely wrap up, one of the threads of Afrocentrism here in the New World is that West African societies put ships in the Atlantic who sailed west and who inspired the development of complex societies in the New World, particularly the Olmec. And you know, that is a very common theme. It harks back at least to Ivan van Sertima, who's a history prof, I think, who wrote a book called "They Came Before Columbus." And what he claimed essentially, I mean, so when you boil it down, the Afrocentrists, Ivan van Sertima in particular, looked at those 17 giant, the Olmec heads, these sculptures, these monumental sculptures that weigh many tons of individual, we believe, Olmec rulers. They basically looked at those and they said, wow, a lot of them are made of basalt, which is a black stone, hint, hint. A lot of them have very broad noses, hint, hint, and they have full, thick lips. So what these guys essentially were saying was, well, they sure look like Africans to me, which is...
And completely ignored all of the other features on these statues.
And they ignored a whole host of things, not the least of which was, well, actually, there are plenty of people today in Mesoamerica who are clearly genetically Native Americans who share those same features and same characteristics. I didn't want to embarrass. I had a student in my archaeology field school this summer, and I will not name him because I don't want to embarrass him. But he's a white kid. I mean, about as glow-in-the-dark white kid whose face resembled the Olmec sculptures. The shape of his lips, very thick lips, a broad, flat nose, hilarious. But he's a white kid. So you can't. It is the height.
But that's the beauty of America right now, though. We've got such a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities in America to this point. You can't do racial discrimination.
It is the height of folly to do racial profiling on the basis of a sculpture that you go, you know what? He looks, you know, it's like remember the movie Yellow Submarine, the Beatles movie, where he goes, bluish? You don't look bluish. Oh my God. You cannot do that. The archaeology shows really clearly that Olmec civilization developed on its own, and that if highly sophisticated West Africans landed in the New World and found a bunch of, you know, primitive agriculturalists, well, how in the hell are they going to snap their fingers and suddenly the Olmec are going to be carving 40-ton statues and moving them 80 miles? That can't happen. The archaeological record shows very clearly this happened independently.
But people think the Olmec society only ever produced those giant statues. The Olmecs produced quite a bit of cultural material, including pottery and other works of art that echo the traits of the giant statues. But again, you know, you can put up 2 or 3 different artifacts from the Olmec society that are humanesque in appearance, and they don't look anything like each other.
Right. But this kind of, wow, doesn't that face look? You see that in a lot of the fusionist literature, where at a single site they'll go, well, this looks like he's Roman, and this looks like he's Jewish, and this looks like he's black, and this looks like he's a Laplander, and so they've got these maps of people coming from all over the world and settling in, I don't know, New Mexico on the basis of what some piece of art looks like. You know what? One bone with DNA with good haplogroup typing would do more to convince scientists of that kind of contact and that kind of visitation than all the statues in the world that somebody with, you know, one eye closed and your head cocked go, well, yeah, he sure looks like a black African to me, or he sure looks Jewish to me. That's just crazy. That's a fool's errand, and I think can be dismissed out of hand.
Well, and the other problem with that line of thinking is that people don't seem to understand how not isolated ancient cultures were. There's this idea, I feel, that people think that ancient cultures existed in bubbles, and those bubbles never touched. And we have a lot of evidence that proves that's not true. And so if you've got a steady trade, if you've got steady trade going on between two cultures, it is not inconceivable to believe that there is intercultural marriage going on. And if you've got marriage going on, you've got kids being born, and these kids are going to pass on the traits of their two parents. So as much as I say, modern America is a melting pot of ethnicities, it's not that different from the way that the ancient worlds were either. So you've got a lot of mixing of traits, and that's why you can have people in ancient America or ancient Europe and even ancient Africa who are sharing traits across their ethnicities. And it's because they didn't just, there wasn't like this little invisible fence that went around went around Egypt, and nobody could leave that fence to go have relations with people outside that fence.
But we do set the bar pretty high. It's one thing to say, hey, look, in the American Southwest, there's evidence of chocolate, and that's a tropical crop, and it must have come from somewhere else. And we had evidence in West Mexico of turquoise, but there are no turquoise sources in West Mexico. So it's one thing to say, hey, listen, we can actually trace trade across what today is the modern border, the one that Donald Trump is going to put up a wall around. It's one thing to say that, but the bar is pretty high to prove that.
Right.
And so when you're talking about people coming from West Africa and visiting and having a huge impact on people in Mexico, you have a pretty high bar that you have to pass over. Now, as archaeologists,
you're strengthening my point, though, because if there is evidence of trade, which that is evidence, the turquoise and the chocolate.
Right, exactly.
That's evidence of trade. If there's no evidence of trade between two cultures, you're going to have a really hard time convincing me that there was anything else happening. Because it's just, why would they even be here? How did they get here? How did they survive getting across the ocean? Where are their boats? Yeah. Where's the trash? I always come back to, where's the trash?
What's really cool is that supposing we had no written documentation concerning the Spanish entrada, that is the Spanish exploration of the American Southeast. Supposing De Soto and his guys never wrote anything down, De La Vega never wrote anything down. None of these guys wrote anything down. So we had no historical evidence. Archaeologists working in the Southeast find all kinds of stuff along the routes those Spanish explorers took. They find beads from, glass beads from Europe that we know historically the Spaniards were trading with the Indians. We find copper bells that we know was brought here. So even if we didn't have the historical documentation, archaeologists would be finding these alien objects, this trash, that we know, wait a minute, there's no evidence of this being made here ever, but there's archaeological evidence of these beads from Europe. Archaeologists would immediately seize on that as evidence of contact.
And this is one of the places where Afrocentrism falls apart, along with all of the other centrisms.
You got it.
There is no evidence of that. We know what the cultures that we're talking about, we know what their artifacts would have looked like, we know what their goods would have looked like, and we know what other cultures they were trading with, so we know what their trade goods would have looked like, and we don't see anything like that over here.
Exactly. And will it end my world if tomorrow an archaeologist reports that, wow, they found a site on the coast of El Salvador or on the coast of South America that looks like a pre-Columbian settlement of Africans? Wouldn't end my world. That'd be awesome. But again,
really kind of cool.
But again, the awesomeness of it depends on the evidence used to support it. The mere fact that it would be cool doesn't mean that's enough.
Yeah, it doesn't make it real.
Yeah. Of course, I always think it's ironic when at least people who aren't necessarily Afrocentrists, but apologists saying, yes, but it really gives a poor, oppressed class of people a nobler history, or it expands their history. I go, yeah, but what does that do to the Native Americans who they thought it was their culture that produced the Olmec civilization?
And not only that, you're basically saying, and when you say something like that as an apologist, you're basically saying, oh, these poor people, they have nothing else but these lies. And it's like, you know what? These people did some really amazing crap. How about we not make up stories and lies about them and instead tell the truth and get it out there so that people know that there's all these all these cultures that were in Africa around the same time and before Egypt, and quit taking things away from the peoples who are native to different locations. No, I think that's an absolute horrible thing to say.
What you've just said is the perfect encapsulation of what the whole point of this of today's podcast was. Absolutely perfect.
Yeah. So there you go. We're going to end on that then.
I think so.
Well, thank you, Ken, very much.
Oh, absolutely. You're welcome. And any nasty letters anybody wants to send, you send them to Sarah.
Oh, they will.
There you go.
They will.
But no, this was fun. And again, understand, it's not Afrocentrism that good archaeologists are in opposition to. It's any centrism that says some ancient part of the world, they were better than everybody else. We're elevating them to a superior status, and everybody else borrowed from them.
Yeah. There's, again, no evidence of that ever happening. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, I think that's our wrap, and I will talk to you next episode, Ken.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Don't do dinosaurs. I getting it? Maybe?
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
And Romans, human evolution makes us smile.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Your cardiologist knows your heart, and your mom knows how to mend your heart. Your ophthalmologist helps you see, and your best friend makes you feel seen. A visit to your physical therapist can heal your shoulder, and a visit to your grandma can heal your soul. Your health is a journey you don't take alone. Just like the people around you, all of us at Kaiser Permanente work together to help care for all that is you. Learn more at kp.org. Kaiser Permanente, for all that is you.